Okay, let's get this thing started. So this is officially a Warg group play guide. Now, before we talk about the structure of this video and exactly what we're going to go over, let me talk about what this video is not. First off, it is not a Warg 1v1 guide, nor is it particularly a it's not particularly a, like, how do you play Warg, this is how you rotate, these are this, like, I'm not going to go into that. I already have a Warg guide elsewhere that goes over some of those details. I also have Warg coaching on this very channel that goes over some of those more details, and maybe that's something that we do in the future, but for now, this is going to be assuming that you kind of already have a baseline of understanding how to play Warg, knowing the basics of the rotation, the basics of positional damage, all those sort of things. And then what we're going to talk about is how we can take those and apply those into group play. Now, if you're new to Warg, you will still get a lot of value out of this guide because we're going to talk a little about the structure here, because the structure of this video is going to be talking about raid level 1. In other words, what are the fundamentals of playing Warg in a raid, even if you're not particularly good, and then level 2 of raiding. And then we're going to move on to 6 versus 6 or small group action. So this doesn't have to be 6 versus 6, but we'll just say 6v6 level 1 and then level 2 for 6v6 as well. And basically this is done not only to differentiate between some of the different strategies you might use in larger groups and smaller groups, but also to differentiate in terms of level of difficulty, because as you start to move from raid level 1 to raid level 2 to 6v6 level 1 to 6v6 level 2, your contribution becomes a lot more important and your job becomes a little bit more tricky. So again, this is a Warg group play guide. This is not a Warg 1v1 guide. If you are somebody who raids frequently, groups frequently, small groups, 6v6s, joins 3-mans and runs around, this is going to be very helpful for you. Another thing that this guide is not, so we'll change our color here, not a 1v1 guide, but this is also not a raid guide strategy. In other words, this is not a raid leading strategy, rather. This is not a guide on how do I lead raids better. This will go over some of the details of things that you can maybe use if you were to lead a raid or shot call in a raid. But this, if you're looking for information on what are the best strategies for beating creeps right now, this is just more of what is Warg's part to play in those strategies, and not so much all the details and the important big picture stuff of the strategies themselves. So if you're looking for something like that, unfortunately, this is not it. So let's talk a little bit about Warg before we actually start to go into the guide itself. So Warg is, and this is going to be a little bit of a hot take, so listen carefully, it is arguably the highest initial utility of any creep. So high utility. Now, normally when most people think of Wargs, it's just, oh, they do a lot of damage and then burst and then you die in the stun, or they do nothing at all and they're terrible and they just run around, they hips or disappear or sprint or whatever. But Warg actually has some unbelievably powerful utility. It is the most powerful offensive utility on creep side, hands down. We'll talk a little bit about how that is and why that is. And it's actually surprisingly simple. In raid versus raid. So in 6 versus 6, it gets a little bit trickier, but raid versus raid, it's actually very simple. So it's unfortunate that Warg has got such a bad rap in raid versus raid fights, because actually when played relatively well, not even great, just played relatively well, it provides a lot of value because its utility and value is very simple to achieve. And we'll talk about how to do that. The reason why has Warg been considered bad in group play and specifically raid play for so long is it's not super intuitive. In other words, some of the things that we're talking about today, if you spend a lot of time with the class, paying very close attention to how your skills function, all this stuff, then you'd understand exactly like what, you could probably have a pretty good guess about like what the utility is. But most Warg players aren't really familiar, like how their debuffs work and what's strong and what's not. And so they might be unfamiliar with exactly what is the most valuable thing to do in a raid or a group play. The other thing that makes it a little bit tricky is it can also be a little bit mechanically challenging. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, but just for now, just assume that Warg in its current state is one of the more difficult heroes to move about and, for example, just do simple damage on while you're doing your job. Keep in mind, the job is simple, but then you also have to be rotating and DPSing and double tapping eye gouge and moving around the map. And as a melee class, obviously, you almost always have it harder. Lastly, the way most Wargs play it, most Wargs are cowards, and let's just be honest. Most Wargs play the class fully exploiting the escape cooldowns, running away from fights, avoiding death at all costs. I knew a Warg back in Winful, I won't say his name, who used to log off every time he died. If he died once today, he would log off. And that's basically how he played, was to avoid death as much as possible. And unfortunately, a huge chunk of the Warg population plays like this. And it's not a surprise. The class design with the escape cooldowns isn't very good for that. So that means that you have a lot of wargs. There's almost always, we always joke around, like whenever you're running around with a small group, there's always 6 wargs waiting to pounce once everyone's low in HP. And that's just tragic because the class itself has a lot of utility, has a capability to help and swing fights a great deal. So I encourage you wargs out here or people interested in warg to watch this guide, take some of the things down and go out there, join raids, join groups and practice this stuff. You will find value, I promise. Okay. So first thing we're going to start off with is we'll talk about the essential things that we're going to assume that you have down before we even start talking about the things. So like I said, this is assuming that number 1, you already have mouse turning or mouse turn or key turn speed. Sorry for my handwriting. I'm not actually drawing this. I'm clicking. Key turn speed is already high. So I don't, key turning is just straight up a disadvantage. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you, but if you turn your turn key speed to very high, it's doable. It's very, very doable. I know a lot of good key turners, but you definitely do not want to be the guy that's turning like a truck. You're playing a very fast melee class, rapidly swapping targets in raid. You can't be gimping yourself here. Absolutely no skill clicking. No exceptions here. Skill clicking is a serious gimp, significantly more impactful than key turning. It is not something that you should ever be doing with warg. Your class that has to double tap things, please just no skill clicking. Please. There's other classes you could probably get away with skill clicking, although it's always a disadvantage, but warg is not one of them. Okay, third thing. You need to understand the ability to listen. We'll just put this as listen, but essentially the idea is that you need to listen to and follow your leader or target assist. Everybody in raid versus raid needs to be following the target assist, needs to be following what the leader is calling. Guys, move this way. Guys, group up. Guys, go this way. As warg, sometimes those group up calls aren't always necessary. We'll talk about that in a second. But you need to be following the target assist and doing exactly what he or she says. A lot of times it's going to be very frustrating as a raid or a group leader when people are just simply not listening. There is really no exception for that. There's really no exception for this rule. You always need to be listening to TA, following your leader, doing exactly as they say in terms of the basic movement and target focus. Otherwise, you do not belong in group play. You do not belong in a PvP area. It's better to be on target, for example, than it is to be like doing all the tiny little details I'm going to give you in here. So you're going to have to learn to prioritize, which is why the raid versus raid is simpler than the group versus group, because you oftentimes just don't have time to do all the details. Okay, the last one, don't overvalue. I need to clarify that. It's better to just stay. If you did nothing else but just follow target assist and use random skills, you would be better than a lot of wargs already. The last one is some foundational knowledge of the class. So I'm just going to set the foundation of, you know that Claws is strong. You know how Eye Gouge works. You know that Maul is stronger than Rend. In terms of actual DPS rotation, you know what Rend does. You know that Piercing Claws is good. You know how to double tap. You know that Swipe is more strong than Rend when you already have the debuff, and so on. Like, you don't have to know every single detail, but you do need to have a foundation of, I can move relatively well, I can use my rotation, and so on. Because when you get into group play, it's another layer. It's an entirely another, in fact, it's not even one layer, it's multiple different layers. So if you have a hard time rotating, you're not very comfortable with the warg rotation or the warg class in general, it might be difficult to keep up with the additional things that you have to worry about in raid versus raid. Now, to be honest with you, especially in raid versus raid, your impact from damage and rotation is less important because you're a smaller percentage of the overall DPS output. However, it's still important that you're able to do some damage, and if you're really, really, really struggling, it might be better to work on just getting the fundamentals of warg down first before we start to worry about the details of raid versus raid or group play. Okay, so that covers all of that. We're going to go ahead and get into builds, corruptions, food, all the little details to set the stage for the actual guide itself. Okay, we're going to go into corruptions, builds, and traits. Now, the first thing to understand is that this is extremely contextual. It depends very much so on the circumstances of where you're fighting, who you're fighting. Is it a 6 versus 6? Is it a raid versus raid? And then deciding from there. Now, the first thing that I would point out is that in general, PMET is almost always going to be unquestionably extremely strong, at least 3 PMET. The number of champions, obviously you've got your Heart Seekers, your merch shots from Hunters, Burglars, Guardians. There's it's just champion meta, right? There's champions everywhere. So champions means PMET. PMET means less damage from physical sources, but also the BPE, which is extremely useful as well. In terms of the corruptions, besides that, 3 crit is always helpful because you're going to be relying on doing some damage, but also you need Rend to proc very quickly. And then from here, it's going to be a lot of personal choice. Now, if you're fighting up against hunters who are using fire oil or hunters that are using light oil, which is going to be very common, maybe a DPS minstrel, maybe a lore master, maybe we're seeing arcades out there, yellow arcades out again. Those are things that are going to demand 3 tactical mit. Now, Freeps have a lot of way of reducing your mitigation, so I don't recommend going more than 3 of each type, because if they put enough debuffs on you, you're going to have quite literally 0 mitigations anyway. So these are just to discourage or force them to have to use full debuffs to actually nuke you down. But going over capping isn't really useful in group play. Now from here, this is where a lot of personal choices. Let's say that they are running just champions, nothing but champions. Well, then I might go, okay, 3 crit, 3 physical mit. Let's let's throw in a morale here, a couple morale. Let's do that, and let's get 3 mastery for sure. And then maybe I'll go, I'll use another crit. We'll do a little bit more damage, or maybe I'll be like, ooh, I want to be a little tankier. I'm a little scared. They don't have any mit debuffs, so I'm going to use this instead. I generally run whenever we're doing 6 versus 6s. If I know the class, like if they're using, let's say, a champion and a hunter mix, I'm going to be going 3 of each mit, 3 crit, and 3 tactical. And I know people are going to be like, well, what about your morale? Well, morale is already pretty high with IP and the aura from the war leader, so I'm not really as concerned with that. But a lot of it is personal choice. I do not recommend slotting finesse. I do not recommend slotting resistance. I do not recommend slotting damage for power, damage for health. Any of these things, do not recommend slotting critical defense. There could be an argument for critical defense, depending, maybe if we start to see a lore master meta where they're zeroing out mits, maybe we start to see more crit defense comes back in. But for right now, this is my standard build. If there's mixed, and if there's let's say no champions, I remove my 3 femit and I include a couple other things. If there's no tactical, then I'll remove these, and maybe I'll throw in a morale, 2 morale, maybe an tactical mitigation, or another PMet, or maybe I'll throw in another mastery. But I highly recommend and raid versus raid to focus more on health, getting bigger chunks of HP and mits. And in 6 versus 6 or a small group action, it's going to be important that you have probably 3, and then whatever else you need from there. Because remember, the smaller the group size, the more impactful your damage is. The larger the group size, the less impactful your damage is. And it's more important that you just survive long enough to get your debuffs out. So let's just say we're doing small group action here. And this is what I might run if they're running a hunter champion mix. Now, race traits, this one is a little tricky. Now we'll look really quick at the way the mitigations work out with Foe of the Light, because this is the first tricky one, because it's over 200,000 tactical mitigation. So if you look at here, 46 here without it, and then I put it on, and it's going to jump me all the way up to 54.9. So it's pretty impactful, about 8% mitigation level. So that's something you're going to be wanting to decide on depending on the enemy team's composition. So this one and Pack Elder can flip-flop depending on the situation. My PMets are definitely going to hurt because of it, but that's kind of like, that's just, you have to kind of, take your poison, right? Pick your poison. Now, this is the interesting thing, because a lot of people are going to be like, well, why don't you remove one of the other traits? And that might be okay, but there's also arguments for these as well. Run speed, I would not recommend removing this ever. The 10% in combat run speed is really, really important. I recommend always leaving this on. This one, it depends. You can get away with removing this one if it's raid versus raid. If it's raid versus raid, I might remove this. But the loss of crit is actually pretty significant. I'm not going to go over every single number. You guys can test them yourselves, but you lose a lot of crit, and you do lose damage as well. Pack mentality, you lose actually a ton of parry, evade, and resist especially. Resist is a big one that you're going to need a lot of the time, and you lose a lot of resist losing this one, and you have to have pack hunters. You can't not have pack hunters, period. So I would recommend you can look to make your own decision, decide on the situation. Maybe, like I said, if you're going raid versus raid and you're like, I'm not really worried about doing any damage at all, so maybe I might do something like this, right? The other thing you can keep in mind as well is the Howl, the unnerving skill, is a fear. It is AoE. There's a 50% chance to apply. It has a very low cooldown, only 20 seconds. And this is fairly useful as a defensive skill, or as an offensive skill, messing up the enemy team, and then you can basically smash them. But I'm not a huge fan of this, considering what you have to give up for it. So toy with it, make your own decision, and we'll move on. Class, these are like armor boost, unquestionably important. Long strides, unquestionably important. Element of surprise, absolutely. Sprint, absolutely. Disappear, absolutely. Eye gouge, absolutely. And this is the funny thing. Usually stealth is definitely a must. I would say in raid versus raid, where you're going to be doing a lot of scouting, I'd keep this one as well. Try taking it off, just feel how awful it feels. However, if you're doing small group action, or like let's say an organized 6v6, you really don't need this because you're not going to be spending almost any time in stealth at all. Most of the fight you're going to be out of stealth. So I might remove this and replace it with resistance boost. Simply because you can actually do a pretty big boost. We'll actually look at the number here. You're gonna, let's say, so do tactical resist, 42.4, and you jump all the way to 48.2. It's like 6% resist. That's a lot of resist. So something to consider. Maybe if you're berg hunting, you could swap this out for your enhanced disappear. But there's a lot of options. Actually, there's really not a lot of options here. These two are worthless. Rallying Howl is not good unless you're warg packing. Scent Spray, only good if you're like hunting for bergs. This is not super useful unless you're scouting. This is fairly useful. Shadow Fang, unfortunately, back in the day, it was important to use shadow or tactical damage. Back in the day, like 6-8 months ago, a year ago, versus heavy and medium armor classes, but that's not really the case anymore. So I would recommend probably running like this in 6v6s and running like this in 12 raid versus raids, massive zergs, small group action, etc. Okay, now for the other details, we'll go over real fast. Couple of things to talk about here. The number one delving pot in terms of importance, if you can't get the other ones, is the armor pot. Now, it does have a chance of being debuffed significantly. One ancient craft will completely wipe it out, but if we look at my mitigations with and without, right now it's 33.5, so I'm in a glass build. Let me go to a more reasonable build really quick. But it's extremely important. By far the most important delving buff there is. It lasts a long time. I highly recommend using it. So let's throw these on. Okay, so my PMET right now is going to be 49.5 and 46.0. Now I just click one pot, boing. Now watch this. Jumps up by almost 10% and also jumps up almost by 10% on each mitigation. That's a lot of extra survivability just from the delving bot. Please, 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 please use these in group and raid versus raid. Resist and evade, also useful. I'm not going to click these right now because I'm poor in combinations, but these are impactful, so I recommend using them. And then in terms of food, obviously your regen food is helpful. It's not super, super important. It might expire in longer fights. But in terms of the actual special food, so look at this guy right here. There's really only two that are worth using. This one is by far the most consistent one because it stacks with your damage source reduction. So you guys remember your audacity? It's 40%. It's 42% right now because we control the fragment of mortared scrant. So that stacks. If you put on your incoming damage food, that's going to jump from 42 to 46. If you can combine with the Tome of Defense, and now it's 56. And so it becomes more and more and more powerful as you go up. We'll talk about how these numbers are calculated in a second, but needless to say, it is extremely important. The only other thing that you might consider using, not the health, that's not very useful. Not the power, obviously. Not the 5% damage, because it's actually not 5% damage. It just adds 5% to 184, so it ends up being like 2%. Is the keeping Grotham's own little folk. So yeah, it's disgusting. So the reason why this is worth using is we talked about how high you can get resist, especially when you're running tac mit and the resist spot. I think you can almost cap out like 50% just from that. If you also use your little resist corruption in here, you are going to, I think, reach 50. But then you use this sucker, and this actually puts 7% on top of the cap. So you go 50% capped out, right? But then it adds 7% on top of the cap, so you're actually at 57 resist. That is huge if the enemy team is running tactical classes at all. Warden, anything that's going to have like multiple things that can be resisted. Champs, not so much. Very, 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 very annoying for the freaks to deal with. Not a lot of them are going to have super, super high finesse, so that's going to be absolutely obnoxious to deal with, and it's going to provide more value than the minus 4% incoming range damage. So, or I say incoming damage. So depending on the enemy composition, either one of these two are pretty strong. Just depends on the circumstance. Okay, in terms of anything else, I think that's mostly going to cover it. Make sure that you have your pots available, your red, green, purple, and yellow. We'll talk about the importance of those later on. and we'll move on to the next section. So we're going to go and hop into our raid versus raid level 1 thing. Now, the first thing is to understand I'm going to be tabbing back and forth between drawing some stuff with Epic Pin and in-game to explain some skills. So the number one thing that you can be doing as Warg in raid versus raid is scouting. Now, what scouting does is it provides information about where the enemy team is positioned, where your team needs to be focused, where is the flank, where do we need to meet them. Sometimes you might be split off just 100 meters or so, watching out for flanks, scouting from where they might be set up. Sometimes you might be even across the map. For example, you've got a crate on TR, you're near GV, oh no, they're riding out, get ready guys to meet them, or you know, maybe you're over in the Eisen Deep, oh no, they just flipped Eisen Deep, let me check to see if it was them, you know, and they come back around, which might mean that you're not always involved in the combat, or you might be late, but it's worth losing one Warg when you've got around 25 creeps, just to find out where the freeps actually are. The next thing you need to be worried about is the really important contribution of Warg in combat. In fact, the most important contribution of Warg in combat. Remember when we talked about Warg being the #1 creep utility debuffer on the freep target in terms of offensive value? Well, this is where we start to talk about it. And those two things are Rend and Puddle. Now, Shadow Pack does, as you see here, 250,000 and 106,000 around of physical and tactical mitigation respectively. Now, I actually tested how much physical mitigation this is, and it's around 8%, at least on my Lore Master. So let's talk about that, because when I say 8%, it's not 8% raw damage, it's 8% raw mitigation, which is better. We're going to talk about how that is or why that is really quickly here. So when we're talking about mitigation here, if my thing wants to go change the color here, whoops, it's not working for me. Okay, so when we're talking about mitigation, if I am a 40% mitigation Lore Master, 8% is going to take me down to 32 mitigations. Now, why is that not only 8%? Well, think about it. If I use a skill that does 100 damage on a 40% mitigation Lore Master, that's going to spit out a number of 60 damage. I'm going to do 60 damage on a 40 mitigation Lore Master. Well, if I do it on a 32% mitigation target, that's instead going to spit out a higher number of 68, right? And if we go from 60 to 68, that's an 8/60 increase. Now, I'll do the math slowly. 4, 30, break this fraction down, 2, 15, 15 goes into 100, so if we convert this into a percentage, 6 2/3, right? So we multiply this by 6 2/3, and now you've got 13, and it's like 13.33, right? So it actually becomes a multiplicative increase of 13.33% from physical mitigation sources. Now that's on a light armor. So the way the math works is the more and higher mitigation level that the target has, for example, if this is a heavy armor, like let's say maybe a Guardian with 55% mitigation, that 8% hits him a lot harder because it takes him all the way down to 47%. You run the numbers and you're going to end up having numbers that are a lot higher. I'm not going to take the time to do that right now. But essentially, mitigation debuffs are not just raw, oh, they lost 8% mits, that's 8% more damage. No, no, no. It's more than that. And the more mitigations the target has, the more valuable that mitigation debuff, or even necessary, that mitigation debuff becomes. So, important to know this. Your Puddle is very powerful in raid versus raid because it multiplies every physical damage source by that 13%, maybe more depending on their mitigation level. So, moving on from that, you have another multiplicative value debuff, and that's Rend. So we're going to go and tab back, and we're going to look at Rend. Now, everybody knows Rend does 10% more damage on the target, or does it? Because it's not just melee damage, it's also ranged, and it's not just melee and ranged. Notice that it says plus 10% incoming melee or range damage. So if we go into here, do you guys remember the incoming damage fruit discussion where we talked about how it actually stacks with the other things and it goes higher and higher and higher, 42 to 46 and so on? Well, Freeps have this too, at least right as of today. And this right now, I believe when they're in full audacity, I believe is 30%, but they also have ways of increasing it. They have their buffs up here when they capture the relics. They have population buff, the call to Lena Hell's Arms or whatever. Really annoying. Everybody hates it, right? Toma Defense. They have numerous other class skill ways of reducing it. Everybody knows Cappy Bubble, right? Well, there's a trillion other ways. Minstrel has ways of reducing incoming damage. Lore Master has ways of reducing incoming damage. Arcade Bubbles add 10% to this number in here. So like, let's say you've got Freep Audacity at 30%. If an Arcade Bubbles himself, that jumps to 40% and becomes way more effective. And so there's a ton of ways that Freeps have of increasing this number higher and higher and higher and higher, making it harder and harder and harder to do damage to them. And remember, just like the mitigations, the higher this number becomes, it becomes exponentially higher. Going from 0 to 10% is not a lot. Going from 30 to 40% is significantly stronger, because if I'm thinking of how the calculations are done, if I go from 0 to 10%, that's just a 10% reduction. But if I go, like let's say a skill does 100 damage now, it does 90 damage now, right? So it was a 10% reduction. But if I go from 30 to 40, my skill was doing 70, right? And now it's doing 60. So now it's 1/7 or 1/7 of a reduction, which is going to be a lot higher, right? Around a little over 14% rather than 10%. And that gets higher and higher and higher as you go. So the way Rend works is it doesn't just do minus 10% as an overall debuff. It actually goes into your target's vitals. And I've tested this. And it will go into your target's vitals and it will reduce this number by 10%. You see this 42 here? If I was sparring another Warg and they rended me, that would drop it from 42 to 32. And you guys remember how mitigations work, right? It's not just 10%, it's more. So let's say if the target on Freep side is at, let's say there's no incoming damage bonuses. Let's say they're at 30% with the Audacity. You're dropping them from 30 to 20, guys. From 30 to 20, which means your skill goes from 70 to 80. It's 1/7 increase. It's not 10%, it's 14% plus. And if they're using bubbles, the Elm incoming damage buff, they're using Cappy in harm's way, they're using, I'm trying to think here, CNR, you guys know concession and rebuttal and RK. This becomes a bigger and bigger percentage because as their incoming damage, let's say, goes all the way to 40% with a lot of buffs, or even 50% with a lot of buffs, maybe they got Tome of Defense and population buff, this goes from 50 to 40. So now instead of my claws hitting for 50 damage, it's now hitting for 60 damage. Guys, guess what? That's a 20% increase in damage. So it becomes more and more powerful and more crucial the more incoming damage buffs the Freeps have. The more ways they have reducing your damage, Rend becomes that much more crucial. And remember, what is the damage source that it does it on? It's not only melee, it's range too. So all of your BAs, all your Reavers, all your Wargs, all your War Leaders and Shield Bashes, right? Everything is doing significantly more damage. And remember, this stacks with Mits. Mits debuff the mitigation side of damage resistance. This debuffs the incoming damage side of things. It's a very confusing system. Thank you, Lord of the Rings Online, for creating a stupid and not a non-intuitive system, but that's just how it works. So ladies and gentlemen, when we talked about what Warg brings to the table in terms of actual damage debuffs, one Warg in a raid using nothing but Puddle and Rend can increase the targets by 14% on the mitigation and 14+% on Rend Flesh. And that goes for all targets, on everything that you want to put this on. It's going to immediately do that. So very, very impactful. One Warg alone can significantly increase the damage of each and every ranged and melee DPS in the entire raid. Guys, you must get this done. Now, we'll talk about how to do it. It's not hard. What I like to do is when my TA swaps to the target, I'm going to use my claws, proc my crit response, Rend, very important here, Puddle, I have it keep on here, double tap, eye gouge, claws. And that's your burst rotation. Your target assist swaps to a target. Oh no, they swapped to heavy training dummy Kelson. I don't know why they have names. I'm gonna go over, oh no, hit my claws, proc my Rend, and then bang. And you should be able to do that with practice in about 1.5 to 2 seconds tops. You've got both debuffs immediately available, and you want to try and do that as soon as your target, before your raid leader says 3, 2, 1, go. At around 2 or 1, you want to have that Rend available. So all those BAs that are using those puncture targets, those VTs, when that Reaver uses their Impale, you already have your Rend debuff up. You already have your Puddle up. So all the big hitters are already ready. Debuffed on the enemy team. So now I know I spent a lot of time talking about this, but I cannot understate how crucial this is. This is where a huge chunk of your value of the Warg is going to come in raid versus raid and group versus group. Use that Rend, use the Puddle, and make sure that target is CC'd. It must be CC'd. So That's the last thing I will say with Puddle. Always double cut it with Eye Gouge, but if your raid is having a hard time locking targets down with CC, or their timing is a little off, what I might do is I might go in and Claws and then Rend, and I might not Puddle until I CC. I might just be doing individual skills one at a time, saving Eye Gouge. There's a CC, bang! And immediately, I'm on it. Something very important to do, but one Puddle alone is massive. One Rend alone is massive. Yeah, okay, we're gonna move on to the next thing. So we talked about scouting, we talked about Puddle and Rend. Those are by far the two most important things. Couple other details that you could be working on as a level 1 raid warg is your defensive cooldowns. Now remember, we've traded Enhance Disappear, cooldown's still long, but it's there, and then Enhance Sprint. Now the cooldown here is quite short. Let me say something. You as a warg should almost never, ever, ever demand a war leader bubble. Never. You should have 2 defensive cooldowns that completely negate the ability for any melee train to catch you. And you also have a complete disappear skill, of course, as well. So what you need to be looking out for is you need to be looking out for when you're being focused. If you start to see your HP drop, if you see Reveal Weakness from Burglar, Telling Mark from Captain, if you see Ancient Craft from Lore Master on you, if you don't know what these tooltips look like, you need to look them up. If you start to see your HP dropping, Grave Wound from Captain, then you need to be prepared. I'm ready to pop Sprint and get out of there, especially against the melee train nowadays. There's not a lot of like ranged DPS. Sprint is really, really good. It completely negates the ability for the enemy team to kill you. Now, if they've got a lot of ranged DPS, you might need to disappear as well, or maybe Sprint is on cooldown. So whenever I'm doing raid versus raid or group versus group on my warg, I almost never, ever, ever, ever die. And if I die, it's because I didn't have a stun break. So that's the other thing. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but as a warg, you should always, the goal should never be to need bubble. Never. Because you're a squishy target, they might try and burst you down, but you should be quick on your brand. You should be quick with your sprint or disappear, and then get right back into the fight again. And because sprint is on such a low cooldown, generally you should almost always have it up. So, apply your debuffs, scout, and don't die to nothing. You should always have a defensive cooldown ready and available, and if you don't, play it a little bit safer or let your war leaders know that you do not have a defensive cooldown. You might need bubble. The last detail for raid versus raid level 1, I know this is a lot, but stay with me. The last detail is Shadow Fangs, and this is going to be this debuff right here. So everybody knows that, oh, I cripple, and then I apply Shadow Fangs, and there's your little bleed. Hey, it's actually pretty decent nowadays. It's not good, but it's not bad anymore. It's worth using every now and then. Okay, but what sometimes people don't really pay attention to is the parry, which is not useful, but the induction debuff. Do you see that? 45 seconds, and the cooldown is only 10. So technically you can get it on 3 or even 4 targets uptime. Usually 3 is the cap. So what this is useful for is when you're talking about free healers, specifically RKs, minstrels, things like that. Shadow Fangs really slows them down. It makes it a lot harder for them to keep their teammates up. Talking about lore masters, we're talking about hunters. Those things struggle to do their DPS, do their debuffs, get their inductions off as quickly with Shadow Fangs. So one thing that I would recommend when you're in raid versus raid is between target swaps, if you have time, maybe you've just used Puddle, you've gone for a burst, it failed, maybe it succeeded, you don't have anything available for a second, immediately have either tooltip or look for a minstrel, RK, hunter, LM, something along those lines within reach, get a Shadow Fangs on them, and then go back and do your DPS, right? Okay, getting ready for next burst. And just leaving that alone, if you get that on even 1 or 2 targets, that's gonna be a big, big, big deal. Obviously in raid versus raid, it's a lot hard to keep track of supports, so it's going to be a bit messy, but this is something to start toying with and practicing with in your raid versus raid. It is warg's biggest, I guess, non-incoming damage debuff. It is really like what separates bad wargs from average wargs in group play. The ability to keep that Shadow Fangs on at least 1 target, permanent uptime, really will help your team get those kills later in the fights. Okay, so that's raid level 1. We're gonna move on to raid level 2. So this is where things are gonna get a little tricky. We're gonna have to add more details. So raid level 2 is all of the previous, the scouting, the Puddle and Rend the target, the defensive cooldowns when you're being focused, knowing what to look for, Shadow Fangs on an available target, and then add, number 1, positioning around speed to TA. So in other words, one of the things that you might get caught up on if you're being a little sloppy with your Shadow Fangs, maybe you're being a little slow, maybe you're a little slow with your key turn speed, maybe you're having a hard time, is you might be very late to burst targets. You might be struggling getting there to get the Rend on time, might be struggling to get there with the Puddle on time. you need to be doing your best to kind of avoid the heat of the battle between bursts and try and set yourself in a position to where you're, as soon as that target finds, that raid leader finds a new target, you're there as quickly as you can. So something, it's kind of an intangible. I can't really give you more details than that, but it's something you want to be consciously practicing. If you're late to burst, you need to be asking yourself, why? Could I have avoided that? Could I have gotten there sooner? Do I need my raid target assist leader to give me another 2 seconds? And then maybe can I tell him or her that? But definitely an important thing for Warg, simply because you will be applying Shadow Fangs on separate targets, which means you might be in a little bit of a situation where you don't get there in time, as well as Puddle needing a second or so to line up with CC, which means you need to be getting there on time. Okay, the other level 2 detail is rallying Howl spam. So I always like to make sure that, especially when we're not like actually bursting a target, RK stones are going to die, maybe a Freep's going to die here and there, a gold tagger in the enemy team, maybe you guys accidentally kill LM pet. You're going to be getting pretty frequently rallying Howl procs here. Do use it. It is a pretty significant heal. You guys can read the tooltip for yourself. It does a lot of healing over the course of a fight. It can help take some heat off of your healers because it is fellowship wide. So if you're not in the middle of doing a burst, puddling, rending, whatever, do use this when it's available, just to kind of keep the pressure off of your healers. Third thing, additional Shadow Fangs target. So when you are getting to level 2, the highest level, or one of the highest level raid Warg level, I guess, do try and get Shadow Fangs on 2 targets. Remember we talked about it's 45-second duration, but only a 10-second cooldown. Getting 2 targets to the Shadow Fangs, if you can find them, is fairly reasonable and something that you should be aiming to do as quickly and as often as you can. Last thing we talked about already, but make sure that you're hammering it. When you are being focused, you need to brand. Brand is a very low cooldown. Look at that, 1 minute. I generally do not like using my brand offensively. In raid versus raid, I guess it depends, but you always want to have either your stun pot or your brand available, because it's just too easy to CC lock you, essentially. So what can happen is you'd be like, oh, I have sprint, I have disappear, but then you get chain CC. Freeps, when they're coordinated well, can lock you down for a very long time. And if you do not have your stun pot or brand, it doesn't matter if you sprint or disappear. You might just die anyway. So I recommend working at that, trying to avoid using both of these offensively just to break general stuns, and to save at least one just in case they target you, because then you go boom, boom, and now you're not killable. You can't be stunned, you can't be dazed. You can only be rooted, but obviously you can then break that as well, and then at that point you've already gotten away. Okay, moving on, the last little detail, and this one's going to be very, very hard to manage. We'll talk about this one in a second, is going to be the pot clearing. So the wound, the spider chin in here, the purple, and the yellow. Now we're going to talk about these. Let me actually tab over, and we're going to talk about some of the debuffs here. So there's a lot of them. Okay, there is a ton of debuffs that you need to be worried about here, and the reason why they're important is the same reason why your Rend is important. It provides a lot of incoming damage or reduces your ability to do damage. So we'll go down the list really. Bjorn, there's nothing really terrible. For Burglar, there's 2 that you can look for. The number one what we need to be looking for is Dust. Watch out for Dust, the red wound thing. It's 15% miss chance last I checked, maybe a little bit more with a tracery. And it's annoying. Very, very, very annoying. Reduces your ability to do damage. It's pretty easily spammable. It's AoE. So definitely try and pot that whenever possible. That's a priority one. And a little bit less of a priority, but it is still important, is in Rage. If the Burglar is yellow, that is a 5%, I believe, incoming damage. Whoopsies here. And that is something that's going to stack with all their other incoming damage buffs, like half of a Rend. So you want to try, it's the ugliest Enrage I've ever seen in my life. So you're going to want to pot that with the yellow pot when you can. Okay, moving on, you have Captain. Doesn't have anything super important, guys. I might be missing a few of these. Don't kill me if I do. Just let me know in the comments. Lore Master, so we'll go on to LM. LM has a couple that you can pot. 2, really 3, I guess, that are important to pot. Number 1 is going to be your Raven debuff, so that's going to be yellow. And there's not a lot of yellow debuffs in the game. It's really just, I think, Raven and then Rage. Those are the big ones. So this one's going to be minus 10% or maybe minus 20% fire mitigations. If they're running a Hunter composition with fire oil, you are going to want to pot this for sure, because that's got a huge chunk of your mitigations. It's like even stronger than a puddle for context. And then the other 2 are going to be the lower fire lower. If you're Warg, this is not as strong as it used to be, but it is still strong. It's something you're going to be wanting to be potting. Usually it might be covered by Sign of Power Command, which is a slightly weaker debuff, but it's something to try and pot if you can. And then the last one is going to be Ancient Craft, and this one is so important. A lot of your armor is gone. A lot of your armor. Your mitigations are going to be toast. So whenever you can, pot this one. We'll go through and circle the big ones. Now, here's a surprise. So Minstrel. Now, this one was a surprise to me as well up till a couple of weeks ago. Minstrel, I don't know why I did this twice. Oh, that's an I, guys. Is the Call to Aromi. I'm not even sure how to spell this. I'm pretty sure this is how it's spelled. And this is a green debuff, so I believe it is a song. So make sure to check this one out. And what this does is this toasts your light mitigations, which might not seem like a big deal because you're like, well, the Minstrel's hitting me harder, but who cares? Well, there's one other class that can toast you, and that's Hunter. A Hunter using light oil is going to destroy you if you have Call to Aromi on you. As well as if you're like, let's say you're in a 6 versus 6 or a small group play, it's just always good to pot this whenever you can. It is a massive debuff. I think it's the equivalent of like 3 word puddles. It's like 500,000, 600,000, something like that. So definitely look to pot this one. Trying to think down here with RK. RK has Essence of Winter, and that is an incoming heal debuff as well. I believe it's 25%. If you end up with this on you, it is helpful to pot that for sure. And I'm trying to think here. Bjorn, nothing particular. Burglar, nothing particular. Hunter, quick shot is annoying. So the quick shot slow, everybody knows that one. Spammable, it's really annoying. You can wound pot that one. We actually put that one in red. That's a quick shot slow. And then also Heartseeker debuff. So that's the 50% incoming healing. That might be covered by the bleed though, so beware. This one may not be potable. Let me think here. I believe that is mostly it here. There's one other one, which is going to be the Warden. Wrong color, awesome. And that's going to be your Cry, your green. Let's put this in green. Green debuff. So if they're running yellow Warden, they can apply range debuffs on your tactical and physical mitigations, I believe. This is something that you're going to have to test on your Wardens, but they can put out pretty heavy mitigation debuffs on par with like LM Mini from range. So these are going to be green pots for those wounds. You're not really concerned about the DOTs. Actually, it's more the debuffs themselves that become a problem because they debuff you down, and the RKs or the champs are going to kill you. So you're going to notice a consistent theme here that most of the important stuff to pot, with the exception of like Dust, with the exception of like Fire Lore, most of these are either incoming heal debuffs or incoming damage / mitigation debuffs that you're going to be looking to pot. In terms of priority, big ones to pot here, I'll circle the ones that I think are the most impactful. Dust is like really low hanging fruit. That one is pretty important to pot, unless you're in a raid. But in small group stuff, you need to be doing damage. This really reduces your damage. Ancient Craft is really important. Always going to be important to pot that whenever possible. Aromi contextual, so we'll put that one as half. If they have hunters, very important. If they don't have hunters, not very important. This one's not super powerful. Like there's other incoming heal debuffs that are stronger. These are going to be too hard to pot, so I wouldn't prioritize this one. This one becomes sort of important too, but really Ancient Craft, Dust, these are the easier ones to pot, and they're going to be important. So if I missed anyone, guys, let me know. I'm pretty sure I got most of the big ones, but these are the ones you're going to be looking to pot mid-fight whenever possible. Okay, so for group versus group level 1, there's going to be not quite as many details as raid versus raid level 2, but more details in raid versus raid level 1. So all of raid versus 1 fundamentals number 1. It's going to be the scouting when necessary. It's going to be the obviously making sure that you're getting your puddle and your rend up. It's going to be your defensive cooldown usage in terms of using those to make sure that you don't need bubble. And lastly, making sure that you get Shadow Fangs in at least one target. So those are all your raid versus raid level 1 fundamentals. For group versus group level 1, we take all of that and then we're going to add a couple more. We talked about the defensive brand usage, using that to avoid getting chain CC'd and burst. When you do have a defensive cooldown, you need to either have brand or stun pot available. We talked about that already. Very important. The second thing when you're doing group versus group level 2 is the pot clearing. We just finished talking about that and the raid versus raid level 2, the wound pot, cry pot, your purple pot, your yellow pot, using those to be able to pot incoming damage debuffs and mitigation debuffs. Very important. Again, go back if you want to talk about each of the individual debuffs you should be looking for. And lastly, for group versus group level 1 is Fleas usage. So Fleas is essentially an AoE, 25% inductions, and 25% attack duration. Now, attack duration isn't super strong, but it is impactful, and the induction is powerful too. Now, Fleas is an unusual skill in the fact that it is very flexible with how you use it. You can use it fully defensively. You can use it fully offensively. For example, if you know that you're in, let's say you're in a 5 or 6 man, 8 man creep group roaming around, and you're about to get into a fight, and you're about to burst on that minstrel. Maybe before you do your Rend and puddle pounce, right? Remember that? Maybe you do an AoE Fleas, and then you go right into your little burst thing here. And what that does is, yes, Freeps have a lot of cleanses. They have a lot of ways of removing that, but that's what you want them doing, right? You want them taking the time to use those cleanses to focus. Okay, guys, we're going out pop Fleas. We got to do this. And if they do that, as you're bursting, that's a distraction, right? And that basically enables your burst to be more effective. If they don't remove the Fleas, that means their reaction to dealing with that burst is going to be slower because of the attack duration. So Fleas can be used aggressively like that. The other way to use Fleas is, let's say they're popping all their cooldowns. Like the champs using CBR and Duel, and they just popped Oathbreakers or Oathies on your target, or they threw Banner and they're really bursting, and your Defiler's taking a lot of damage, right? In your group, you can do AoE Fleas as well. And again, it's the distraction here, right? So it's the time spent to remove the Fleas instead of just DPSing down your Defiler. Or if they ignore the Fleas and just keep DPSing, they're all doing less damage. They're all moving slower instead of actually doing stuff. So that's something that you want to exploit. You can use Fleas either defensively to slow down or hurt their bursts, or you can use Fleas aggressively right before your bursts to make it more awkward to deal with your bursts. Okay, now we're going to move on to group versus group level 2. So this is going to be all of raid versus raid fundamentals, adding in details in a second. But first, let's talk about let's just touch on the raid versus raid fundamentals super fast. Level 2, we talked about all of raid versus raid level 1, plus positioning around speed of TA, make sure you're on the TA in time, rallying Howl spam, the additional Shadow Fangs target, defensive brain usage when you get locked down, and using your pot clearing. So that's all important for group versus group level 2. If you're going to get into 6 versus 6, now we start to get pretty crazy. You got to be doing all of raid versus raid level 1 fundamentals, all of raid versus raid level 2 fundamentals, all of group versus group level 1 fundamentals, which is the Fleas usage, right? And then a bunch more details. But before we get into the details here, number 1, when you're in level 2 group versus group, you need to be calling the status of your defensive cooldowns and the enemy's defensive cooldowns as you see them. In other words, when I'm in a group versus group, we're doing 6 versus 6 or a 4-man or something like that, and I'm running around with the war leader, maybe flipping LC, and all of a sudden a group shows up. If I don't have sprint, my war leader needs to know. If I don't have disappear, the war leader needs to know. If we're bursting a target and I see our fates entwined, the RK stone, which makes that RK almost impossible to kill, I need to say something. If that RK pops Armor of Storm, I need to say something. If we're trying to stun a champ and he's got CBR up, I need to say something. So it's important to use your microphone to call the status of your defensive cooldowns, but also any very important enemy defensive cooldowns that are important for your team to know. So use your mic. You don't have to be a chatty Cathy. I'm not super chatty when I'm doing 6v6s, when I'm doing group play, but I do have to call the really important stuff that I have to see or that I've seen so that my raid leader can take that information and use it as need be. Next, the other thing you want to call as well, I almost forgot, is the timing availability of puddle. Because remember, whenever you're playing small group action, or whether you're just playing war group action in general, you are going to be playing heavily around the availability of your shadow pack. So guys, 5 seconds on puddle, then we can burst. 10 seconds on puddle, or I've got puddle ready, right? Those are the informational calls that your raid leader can use, or your group leader, excuse me, to be able to function just a little bit better. The next thing you need to be doing before we get into the details is you need to have a strong understanding of peel value as a warg. Another saying, what can I do when my team is under a lot of pressure? They've popped Oathbreakers. Well, we're probably not going to be going for any bursts right now. We're probably going to be trying to keep our stupid war leader or our stupid defiler alive. So what do I bring to the table? Now, to be perfectly honest with you, Warg does not bring a lot to the table when it comes to pure peel value. There's not a lot you can do, but there are a couple of things. Number 1, your cripple pounce procs. When I cripple, I apply a slow and I apply bitten, which I can then consume with for Shadow Fangs for a bleed, or I can pounce and I have a chance of getting a fellowship maneuver on the enemy target. I think it's about a 50% chance. There's no real actual tooltip, but I've tested it's about 50%. So whenever your team is, oh no, we're getting burst, watch out. If you're able to get a cripple plus a pounce proc to stun one of the DPSers, that can really buy your team a little bit of extra time to survive. It doesn't want to proc from you. The other thing that you could do is tin and shred. So this is Defensively, again, it's a fellowship maneuver. It's something. It's annoying for the enemy freaks to have to deal with that when they're trying to burst you down. And because most of the time when you're doing bursts with Puddle, you will not be the ones he's seeing. It will be your BA, it will be your War Leader, it will be your Spider locking them down in Puddle. You don't need to save your Tin and Shred offensively most of the time. The other thing you can do is Throat Rip, right? Your silence. This will be effective versus captains. It'll be good against lore masters, good against rune keepers, anything that, or a minstrel if they're a DPS minstrel. So if your team is under a lot of pressure, getting burst down, you silence the captain, you silence the lore master, maybe you silence the arcade. That will reduce the damage that they do for a little bit of time. If it's available, AoE Howl, same thing. Right? Same thing on anything around will buy your team a little bit of extra time. We talked about Fleas already. Obviously, Fleas defensively is fairly good. And then the last thing that you can do is if they're running a Hunter or a Lore Master, you can just get on their tail when your team is being bursted and just interrupt. Throat Rip, right? If it's a Lore Master. Interrupt. Make sure that you got Shadow Fangs on it so their inductions are slower. And just basically lock them down. Prevent them from actually getting the debuffs and the damage that they want to do. Part of the reason why Red Hunter is actually so incredibly strong in some circumstances, but so incredibly weak in others, is because in good group play with a good Warg, a Warg between bursts, between puddle bursts, is just going to go and sit on the Hunter and just interrupt everything he does and make it impossible for him to play the game. So when you are under a lot of pressure and they're on a blue or a red Hunter, obviously getting on his tail and just harassing, interrupting can really reduce the amount of damage that he does. So that's the peel value from Warg. It's not great. It's not spider level. It's not like you have anything huge debuffs and CC wise that could slow, like shut down a freak burst, but it is something, and it's something that you need to know if you're going to be a level 2 group versus group Warg. Now, this is the big one. We're going to talk about the details, and these are going to be all the individual skills. We're literally going to go down the list here and talk about what each you need to know in group versus group play, what effect, like how does it affect your skill usage here. We talked about sprint already, defensive cooldown. Make sure that you're running away from targets kiting around. Disappear, we talked about that as well. Flare can be used as a, for example, if you're waiting on War Leader res, and you just have to survive and peel, and we're not gonna be able to get the kill, we just need to survive. You technically can drop Shadow and swap to Flare after about 10 seconds. And then that gives you a little bit more defensives. You can root down people. The Flare root is actually a really strong defensive tool because it prevents like a melee character from going down and chopping on your War Leader while he's waiting to res and so on. But that's a very, very, very niche play. Rallying Howl, we've already talked about. You can spam that off of cooldown. One thing, we'll talk about the class-specific thing of this because there's some tricks with this one. Piercing Claws, nothing special here. I don't really have anything for Frenzy, Scratch and Snip, Swipe, Piercing Claws, Special Claws, nothing to say there. It's all self-explanatory. If you know how to play Warg, you already know how to use these skills. Crippling Bite, sometimes when you are, let's say you don't have a lot of BAs. Excuse me, if you don't have a lot of BAs, you might be necessary for you to keep Cripple, like we're keeping Shadow Fangs on an induction healer. It might be necessary for you to keep Cripple on a melee DPS. For example, a Berg captain. Even a champion, like the sprint doesn't last forever, just most of the time. So sometimes it might be necessary for you to apply Crippling Bite, just because a crippled, like you want to keep melee DPS heroes slowed whenever you possibly can. So let's say you guys only have like one BA and mostly Wargs, then you're probably gonna have a couple of Wargs that are going to need to be keeping Crippling Bite on different targets. Throat Rip. So Throat Rip is pretty self-explanatory. We talked about that one. Basically, it can be used defensively for when you're getting bursted down. Find the captain, find the lore master, find the RK, and lock them down, slow them down. Tin and Shred. So the thing with Tin and Shred, the only thing I'll add with Tin and Shred is sometimes your stun might fail. So if your stun might fail, for example, like let's say your spider gets CC, like I can't stun, you can use Tin and Shred quickly. It's a very short stun, it's not a very good stun, but it's something. So if you're going for a puddle pounce and somebody misses their stun, you can kind of cover their back. Excuse me. Moving on here, Rend Flesh. We talked about the importance of Rend Flesh. It's very important to use it early, as quickly as you can, right before the burst comes in. Like talking like 1 second. You don't want to telegraph your burst, but you do need to get it done before the VTs start pouring in. Otherwise, you're going to lose out a lot of damage. Howl from Shadow. This can be used AoE defensively, AoE aggressively, just as a skill cutter. It's up to you. It's not really super important. We talked about Flea Bitten already. AoE defensive, AoE aggressive, right before a burst. It's up to you. Shadow Pat, please cut this with your pounce. or your eye gouge, excuse me. Please get something pounds. Like we discussed in Raid versus Raid level 1, it might be necessary for you to be patient with your puddle and not puddle immediately on the burst call because the CC might be late. So be attentive. If it seems like your CC is constantly on time, then you're obviously free to shadow pack instantly on that countdown right after you rend. But if you're noticing that CC is late or messed up a lot, sometimes it might be better to just sit on it and quickly react as soon as you see that CC come in with the puddle. Howl Irving, we talked about this. Not sure it's useful to trait. You lose too much, but it can be used defensively in the same way that Fleas can be used aggressively right before a burst, or as they're about to burst down your team, you Howl the Unnerving. Snap is an unusual one, so we haven't talked about Snap. It is not minus 10% melee damage. It is exactly what the tooltip is on your physical mastery. It's going to subtract 10% from this, and Freeps are generally going to be at a much higher percentage. So it's going to be generally like 1 to maybe 3% outgoing damage, so it's not a lot at all. You can use it in defensive phasing, like let's say you guys are waiting on cooldowns, waiting on like your puddle. You can use this on a damage dealer to reduce the damage they do by a little bit, but it just depends on how much time you have and how focused on detail you are. We talked about Pounce procs with Cripple during defensive to slow down somebody. Shadow Fangs we already talked about. Technically, you can get this up on 3 targets reasonably well if the targets aren't too split apart. So keep an eye on this if possible. Like remember, Arcaes, Elems, Hunters, Minstrels. Those are the guys that you're really looking for to get that on. But yeah, moving on. Sudden Maul. One little thing with Sudden Maul. Try and not use it before you burst. So in other words, I see a lot of wargs, they'll go in, okay guys, we're getting ready to burst on the target, and the wargs run over and they're like, you know, doing this over here, and okay, 3, 2, 1. Well, guess what? You just used one of your biggest hitting skills before the burst happened. So any healing or HOTs that were already on the target just healed up all the value. So you want to get that rend, get that puddle, right? Rend, puddle, and then use that maul, because now you got all your big hitters while they're debuffed, right? So that's kind of what you want to be doing. Okay. Moving on here, Eye Gouge, pretty self-explanatory. You definitely can use this to harass Hunters and Elems between burst phases. Rabid Bite can be used to cover, just basically if you're, like let's say if you're playing with the Spider or versus a composition that doesn't have a lot of clears, you could just kind of overwhelm them with debuffs that'll allow you to cover your silences, cover your Fleas, different things like that. Can be useful, not generally. Moving on here, Scratch and Snap, nothing particularly special. I think that's basically it. So yeah, so essentially we talked a lot about the details of each skill and what little details that you can get in terms of value. Pots, I'm not going to go into detail. We already went over that before. The last thing that we have to talk about is the class matchup stuff and what you need to know about the class matchups in group versus group. So this is not going to be comprehensive at all, nor is it going to even really touch on the most important things of each class. It's just mostly just going to focus on, like, as a Warg, what do you need to know, like what do you need to be doing. For Bjorning, there's not a lot you can do against this class, nothing that really specifically affects you. Obviously knowing Sacrifice, what it looks like in terms of a defensive cooldown is pretty important, but not really a big class you need to worry about. This is a fairly decent class for you to use your Tendon Shred or Pounce, Cripple plus Pounce defensive stun on during burst phases. Like you can stun a Bjorning fairly well, so something to kind of keep an eye on, but not huge. Worth noting when they're doing the enraged heal, I can't remember what it's called, when they're stun immune and they're doing a circle, you can obviously just puddle on that, and that makes them generally want to drop it really quick, and then you can stun them. Burglar, nothing crazy. We talked about potting dust, obviously important to know that. Know to look out for Knives Out. That reduces the damage significantly. Not a whole lot here. Burglar is one of the classes that will punish you for not having Brand or Stun Pot available if you're being bursted. So we talked about having one of those two available when you're using Spreader and Disappear. Burglar is going to be the class that's going to punish you if you don't, because they're going to chain CC you, even though you have your Sprint and Disappear, but they don't work if you're chain CC'd. So make sure that you have one of those available, especially when there's a Burg on the Freep side. Captain. Again, nothing super special about Captain. You need to know what Grave Wound looks like, because that is the incoming damage, incoming heal debuff, and you need to know what Telling Mark looks like, because that's the incoming damage mark. So if you see those things on you, you're probably being focused, so you need to be ready to immediately swap to defensive mode as quickly as you possibly can. Outside of that, Captain is, like Bjorning, one of the DPSs that you can stun when you're under your team is under a lot of pressure to buy yourself some time. You can silence them. You can do a lot of different things like that to kind of slow them down during these defensive phases. Worth noting. Champion, everybody hates this class. Not a lot you can do to a champion. Technically, you can slow them, stun them occasionally. but not a whole lot you need to worry about from champion, not a whole lot you can do. Obviously, if you're being focused, look out for Champ's Duel. It stacks so that they're slowest, makes you run really slow. So just be aware of that. That is something you might brand or sprint if you start to get chunked down. Guardian, really not much you need to watch out for. Shield Wall is something that you might see occasionally in smaller group play, but not likely. You know, obviously they have some bleeds you can pot. Not sure that they're worth potting in group play, but yeah, not a whole lot that affects specifically Warg. Hunter, a little more important. You want to watch out for Burn Hot and or Heartseeker. Those are things like when you see them doing the animation of Burn Hot, which is like a big cry, like Cry of the Hunter, and you see that Heartseeker induction, you need to get on the Hunter. You can disrupt, pretty much ruin his day with those induction debuffs, with those interrupts, and making things really difficult for him. We talked a little bit about how you need to be aware of fire and light debuffs from Minstrel and Lore Master. Be aware of those when there is a hunter on the field, red or blue specifically. That can make things very difficult for creeps if you're not aware of this, because it will just basically chunk your bits and the hunter will blow you up. But yeah, hunter is actually a really easy DPS to shut down if they're in red or blue. As a Warg between burst phases, you can just sit on them, really reduce the amount of damage that they do. So that's something always to be looking out for between your puddle Rend cycles. Lore Master, same as Hunter. Dangerous if left alone, but pretty easy to disrupt. Watch out for the Ancient Craft. We talked about that. Watch out for the fire mitigation debuff from Raven as well. There's also a wound pot Shatter Arms. So when they use the bear, they have a Shatter Arms debuff, and that's going to increase your incoming damage from melee by 10%. So worth looking for that as well. If you see that, you can wound pot it. That's going to significantly reduce the amount of damage you take from the champions. So keep an eye on that. Again, you can silence these things. You can induction debuff these things. Keep them pretty busy. Just watch out for the chain CC like Burglar. That's why you keep the stun pot, you keep the brand. They can chain CC you if you do not have brand or stun pot, which means you might die even though you have disappear and sprint available. Minstrel. Same thing, the Call of Aromi, we talked about that already. Be aware of that. That's something that you might need to wound pot under certain circumstances. Not wound pot, excuse me, green pot. The other thing with Minstrel is the flop cooldown is like unbelievably low now. They can just basically flop off of cooldown, so they can be very difficult actually to kill unless they're kind of bad. So be aware of that. They can flop frequently, so you can definitely want to get your Shadow Fangs up on a Minstrel, but sometimes they can be a little bit tricky to kill. Okay, Runekeeper, last two. Runekeeper, the important thing to know with Runekeeper is if they're healing, obviously Shadow Fangs is important. They can be silenced, that they can cleanse it, but it's annoying, right? So like maybe you're in a defensive phase and you got a DPS Runekeeper tearing you up, you can silence that Runekeeper, slow them down a little bit. The other really important thing to note, and maybe one of the most important class details there is that Runekeepers throw out these Fulgurite stones, right? These volcanic stones, the stones in general. You can kill those stones in about 2 claws. And what that does is that gives you defeat response, which allows you to Rallying Howl. That also will give a defeat response for your Reavers, Glory and Victory, Bloodlust. I can't remember. I think that's most of the defeat response there. I think Spider gets one as well. Shelob's Gift, I believe. And that's huge. Like that's a lot of healing for your team. The Rallying Howl is raid wide. Glory and Victory gives a little bit of damage and healing for the Reaver. Shelob's Gift is a massive heal for the Spider. So if you're in defensive phase or you're just like between bursts and you see that RK Stone, your team's gonna love not getting stunned every every like multiple times in a second, and also gives you a free defeat response. Now, smart Runekeepers can de-summon their RK Stones to deny the KB heal, but I promise you 99.9% of RKs are just going to leave that stone out there in group play, and you can just get it kill, free heal, and then you go on from there. So something to be aware of. We talked about Essence of Winter also being something that you might want to remove with your purple pot. It is an incoming heal debuff, but Runekeeper fairly straightforward, nothing super crazy besides those stones. Lastly, Ward. This is a very easy class to shut down. Silences are fairly effective in defensive phasing. You can also slow them, like the Tendon Shred, like we talked about, and the Cripple plus Pounce proc for the Captain Bjorn. You can do those things as well. Obviously, be on the lookout for green potting a lot of their debuffs. They do decent damage, but it takes a long time for them to get started, and they can be silenced, and they can be slowed, and you can stun them. So be aware of that. Most Warden value in group versus group are going to be those debuffs, so be aware of that. But not a whole lot that affects this class specifically. Finally, we'll finish up with some clips of good and bad play. We'll talk about some of the mistakes that I'm making from a group versus group standpoint. Now, keep in mind, this isn't for raid specifically, so a lot of the details that I'm talking about aren't necessarily going to be things that you need to be hammering home in raid. However, I think whether you're more of a 6v6 small group or even a raid work, I think you'll find value out of me reviewing my own footage, and I encourage you to do the same on your own time. Okay, first up, we're going up against a group 6 versus 6 with a damage RK, damage captain, damage hunter, 2 heal RKs, and a champion. So my responsibility here is to make sure that I've got my Rend bubble or puddle on each of the burst targets, of course, and then I'm getting Shadow Fangs as often as possible on at least one of the heal RKs plus the hunter. Now, the Shadow Fangs on the hunter versus Shadow Fangs in the RK can sometimes be a tough decision, but there's generally a good balance of, do you feel like the hunter is going to be a big threat, in which case you should Shadow Fangs, do you not? Then try and keep Shadow Fangs in both the supports. So we're about to call a burst. I'm going to have the comms on just very quietly so you guys can kind of get context for a lot of the decisions that are being made here.
We're going to burst him next. Get ready.
Shadow Fangs on the hunter because I want to make sure that he's debuffed.
Okay, I got Leighton on Rosnir, second up bleeds on him, and then...
Now our strategy was Leighton poison, and then we're going to walk away and come back when the actual stun expires. So what I was doing is I was actually pre-rending, which is a little bit of a cheat move. Allows me to not worry about rending during the burst because the rend debuff is already up ahead of time, and allows me to do claws instead. So probably not something you need to worry about as much in raid versus raid because a solo warg claws isn't going to be that big of an impact. But for me, it was me kind of cheating on the burst.
I'm going to stun. Get ready.
Like right now, I need to quickly see if I can get Shadow Fangs because Latent Poison is just now going up, so I've got about 12, 13 seconds before I need to be back on top of Rosnir.
Burst him. Yeah, we have to wait for the cooldown to come off. Hold on.
So Regression is really, really good at this. What he does is he often positions himself on the perimeter of the battlefield far away, so that if I want to Shadow Fangs him, I have to go way over here and then way all the way back. And then to make matters worse, he'll drop an Arcade Stone on top of himself just to toy with me, just so I don't get the Shadow Fangs, makes it harder for me to, or I'm late to the battlefield. And then even worse, watch what he does with his Arcade Stone.
Gonna burst him.
Stun and then desummon, so I can't even get the KB heal if I wanted to get it.
In 5, 4,
Ooh.
3, 2.
And this is the danger with the Warg. Sometimes you just simply cannot do the Shadow Fangs that the Arcades or the things that you want to debuff are too far away, because I cut it awfully close here. Thankfully, I already applied the Rend before I got back, so I only have to worry about Puddle.
1, bursting him now.
So I reapplied Rend. I should not have done that. I already had Rend up from the previous burst. It lasts 30 seconds. There's no need for that Rend, which means that this Puddle is going to be a tad late. See, the VT has already been applied. The Puddle should have been here already.
Now?
Like that Puddle is a good half second late. But I am going to get the Howl burst, which means I'm going to AoE silence everything around here as well, which is going to be annoying for them. It might hit a Chalet and prevent him from healing Rosnir.
Loading.
On me again.
Combo of the Blight and Puddle, though, is pretty nice. And then Warg with positional. So they're going to pop Arm of a Storm. Very, very hard to DPS through this.
Stay on him. Regression is chain CC'd.
So I should have stun potted this. I still had my brand. I don't need to be sitting on both my brand and my stun pot. I can pop stun pot and we probably would have gotten this kill.
It's Fates.
There's Fates, which means it's going to be significantly harder to kill this target.
Let's back up and turn.
So at this point, I'm screaming, are we going to continue on the target? You guys can't hear my microphone, sadly, but my eye is saying, I have Puddle. Do we want to keep going, or do we want to go back and swap to another target?
They're on always.
All right, we're gonna get on.
So clearly by the tone, we're not interested in continuing, so I go and reapply my Shadow Fangs debuff. Now, what I probably should have done here is there's no point for me reapplying Shadow Fangs here when it's going to last a tad longer. I mean, it really depends on the healer that I respect the most. So maybe I'm Shadow Fangsing on Regression because I think he's a better RK healer. But optimally, if we're doing our bursts fast enough, I can keep 2 Shadow Fangs up on both healers at all times.
We're gonna get on. Get on Rigga.
Tragic. Somebody stuns Rigga right as we said it.
Right, we're gonna burst on Rigga. I got Leighton on Rigga.
I think it's because he was bursting our BA, and so we had to bubble.
I'm gonna rack up some bleeds on him, and then we're gonna go for him. Hold on.
Okay, so putting suppressor on Rigga, then we're gonna swap off and then go back for a burst on Rigga.
We actually I have to get Leighton on way earlier.
There's the Shadow Fangs debuff. Now, right now, I really should be tabbing off and probably hitting on Rosnir a little bit, maybe throwing a silence, looking for a Yeah, looking for a Shadow Fangs on his Shali in about 8 seconds. He's close by.
Hot that if you can.
Brands.
See how close he is? I can very easily Shadow Fangs this rather than chasing regression all the way over there.
I'm mezzing Rosnier, hold on.
So we're calling defensive because we don't have, he doesn't have MT, or he might not have MT, so I'm fleasing defensively.
Defense.
And then going back to interrupting Rigga.
Getting webs down. Alright,
So we go defensive on Rigga to prevent Drawflaws from dying, which means we can no longer burst Rigga because now he's been stunned.
we're gonna burst on Rosnier next. Hold on, I gotta get latent on him. Okay, I got latent
So I get my cheap Rend.
on Rosnier. Hold on.
Now I need to get my Shadow Fangs up ASAP.
That's awesome.
Defensive, defense.
There it is. I'm going for Shali now.
Alright, we're gonna burst
Weird.
on Rosnier.
So I'm really, I really tab over regression and back to Shali. I'm not sure if I misunderstood like how the amount of healers they had, or if I was just thinking, oh, I think I was just because I wanted to make sure that regression had the induction debuff. But this isn't very smart. This is totally fine. Like Shali is still doing a lot of healing, and he's very, very, very close. Whereas regression is across the map. Like this is an extremely risky move for me.
Here in 5.
You see 5,
4,
4, and I'm not even in position. I might not even be positioned. If he sees me here, I'm screwed. There's the
3.
Arcade Stone. Ooh, luckily I do not get hit by this. If I got hit by this, I might have been in trouble. I mean, I'm stun immune, so maybe that's okay. But yeah, that was calling it real close. 2, 1, burst. Again, I pre-Rend, so I don't have to worry about Rend. I can go right to my puddle.
Rosnier now.
That was much better timing.
Flooding.
He turns towards me. I need to whip around.
There's a stun. I'm gonna follow up the mez. Follow up mez him. Hold on. Mezzing.
Follow up Mez. He's still in
still
puddle.
in the-
I
he's
WP a
still in
little
the
too far forward, and we still get the kill. So that was better, but I cut it very close with going for the induction debuff very late. I should have done that significantly earlier, or just taken Ish, who was closer. So well played by regression, not so well played by me. We're gonna skip forward a little bit and go over a little bit more footage.
Okay, I'm getting latent on Rigga. Okay, it's up.
We're
gonna
calling
burst
about to go on
soon. Get
Rigga.
ready.
I need to
Hold
get
on.
induction debuff. Again,
10
regression's
seconds,
across
hold
the
on.
map. There's a stupid
What's up,
Arcade Stone,
Debuff?
and he desummons
We're
it
gonna
before I
burst
can get a
on
KD
Rigga
heal.
in 5,
I don't even look for the Arcade Stone versus regression. He's too good.
4, 3, 2, 1.
So I got CC'd by the Arcade Stone. You see that? Super annoying.
Bursting now. He's
Flooding.
stunned.
I'm very late, so I try and get that puddle up as quickly as I can. Notice I don't have Rend up. It's actually really, really bad. So a lot of our damage has already gone in from our BA, and I was late with puddle because I got CC'd, and I don't have Rend up. So I'm gonna cut with eye gouge. And I need to get that Rend up now. I should not be going for this clause. I should be going for the Rend right now.
Mez on it. Follow up Mez.
There's the Rend
There's
finally. W key expecting him, but he's also slowed and I'm not, so I shouldn't need to be so urgent to W key. I did the same thing with the previous burst.
Light still.
I'll get the next stun.
Heavy fearing.
Stay on it. Stay on it.
Nice. So good CC from our spider and good damage from everybody else, but again I'm just a little bit late.
Got him. Alright, get ready for the res on him. Get ready for the res.
So immediately now, like while we're waiting at res, I should instantly get Shadow Fangs and a Shali and then go from there.
I think
Call Othies. Remember what we do in Peel for Othies?
what if someone get a bubble?
Find Rosnier. He's my designated Peel target, so I silence him.
Stunning Rosnier alone. I got CC on Rosnier.
10 seconds left.
So I know Dread is calling CC and Rosnier, which means I need to find another target to stun. So I actually cut my Fleas here with eye gouge, and then I find the next target that I can harass. There's Pogmir. He's the red captain. He's doing damage.
Rosnier's stunned. He's
Bang.
Fury.
I'm looking for rest though. Please.
And that shuts down any obviously I think at that point like it was already over, but any possible chance they had of going for a burst is now completely gone.
Seconds are left on Ophies. It's down. We're safe.
Okay, we're gonna burst on Rosnier next. Hold on, I got latent on it.
So regardless, good peel from me there. Just a little bit late on the bursts. So this is a little bit of a different one, a different example here we're going to talk about here. So watch carefully about how I use my cooldowns.
Latent's on Runderick.
There's my defensive, my Shadow Fangs debuff.
Doing the countdown. Hold on.
If I have enough time, I'm going to try and get a Shadow Fangs on regression here. This is probably a little bit too greedy for me.
Down you, Dread.
I'm reflecting. Hold on.
Yeah,
Okay, you're gonna burst him in 5.
Ooh, I'm going to get it. It's going to be close though.
4.
It's going to be
3.
really tight. It's going to be really tight. So we're already calling a burst, but I just applied my Shadow Fangs, so it's going to be close.
2, 1.
And then they turn their focus on me. Now, at this point in time, I have to make a very important decision. If I blow my brand here, that means I'm screwed.
1. Bursting Runderick now.
Flooding.
Bursting Runderick
If I'm
now.
focused, which is exactly what they do. They turn their focus on me. I brand to get out so that I can get pressure on the kill, but that now means that I'm exposed to being chain CC'd afterwards.
I'm mezzing.
So I'm like, oh, I'm here, guys. I'm here. I was a little late, but I'm here. By the way, no Rend. That's pretty bad for me. Rend is very late. And then now I'm like, oh, shoot, I'm being focused. So
I'm stunned.
what this means now is because I don't have brand, it's actually a lot harder for me to, like, I can stun pot this theoretically, that like I should have done that, but even that has a delay. So I'm in trouble right now. And because I use my brand greedily, now this means I don't even get a chance to use my defensive cooldowns, and look what happens.
Sick.
Should have stun potted this 100%. But not only that, but because I mismanaged my stun pot, I mismanaged my brand, I'm forced to disappear, and I get bubble at the same time. Absolute disaster. So terrible mismanagement from cooldowns on my end. I should have been a way more patient on the burst. Even if I'm a half a second late, it's okay. I shouldn't have stayed as long going for Shadow Fangs. And then to make matters worse, I don't stun pot. And then also because I don't stun pot and because I don't have brand, I have to blow a defensive cooldown and get bubble at the same time. Terrible, terrible, terrible brand defensive cooldown management for myself. So this is just a little tidbit. So at this point, I've already used a couple of my cooldowns here. So I want you guys to watch how I respond to being focused when I don't have cooldowns. Okay.
Coming on him, hold on. Getting webs out in front of him, he's kiting.
So deep strikes on me, now I'm CC'd. There's our bleeds from the captain, critical defense. Everybody's on target, I can see that. There's revealing mark, and this is the big one. Revealing mark, there's the shatter arms from the, I believe the captain. So I'm like, I don't have sprint, I don't have disappear, I need to start kiting now. Like I need to be kiting through webs, running circles around webs. There's Grave Wound, that's the incoming heal debuff. I need to start now because I can't greed this really because I don't have a defensive cooldown. So I need to know the status of like how hard are they hitting me right now. So I start to kite.
Let's fights again.
I get stunned, so I immediately brand. So now I'm almost unkillable at this point, even though they've got a lot of stuff on me because I've branded and I'm kiting through spider webs, and I've also quickly reacted to them focusing me. I've also got a KB on their RK Stone. I believe the spider killed it, so I'm going to pop that too. Fleas, just to slow them down.
All right, hold on.
Rallying Howl, and I'm going to keep kiting. There's Duel.
Go for Pogmir next. Hold on, I'm getting Leighton on him.
But look what's happened. HOT is on me, Rallying Howl. Several of the captain bleeds, some of the captain buffs and debuffs have expired, so Grave Wounds expired, so I'm no longer scared. So we're about to go aggressive, and I'm actually going to completely ignore them and just focus on going aggressive because I know now that I'm stabilized, the focus has been put on me, but so is my healer's focus, and I'm fine.
I killed the stun, I think.
They look at my HP, I'm like, I'm fine.
All right, we're going to burst. Oh shit, I missed it. Oh, no.
In addition to that, I now have sprint, so if things get really scary, I can then just sprint away.
It's there.
Okay, so we have one more burst coming up here. This is a relatively inexperienced group to 66s, but they offered to do it with us, and we had a great time. This is a pretty clean burst from our end in terms of setting up our debuffs properly. Let's watch.
So that was meant to be on move, because I was switched to move, but they offered you.
Haha. Nice.
So I'm kiting because of Okies, they messed it up.
Alright, we're gonna try to go for Agwest next. Hold on, I'm gonna get Leighton on her. Hold on.
Shadow Fangs on the main
burst on
healer.
Agwest in once the stun gets on. Hold on.
Cheat with my Rend and swap off.
Bursting it in 5,
maybe
4,
maybe
3,
if I can
2.
So like you can see my turmoil here. So I Shadow Fangs Fates just a little bit late, which means I don't get a chance to get Shadow Fangs on farts as well. So that's a sentence I've never thought I'd say in the history of my life.
Bursting it in
So I realized that, like, oh no, Shadow Fangs isn't off of cooldown yet.
5.
So I'm not going to be able to get Shadow Fangs on both healers. So it's more important for me to only get Shadow Fangs on one healer and be there to actually puddle and Rend Agawast than it is to try and wait like we've seen in previous clips. So I learned my lesson.
3, 2.
Rend again, reapplied, puddle.
1. Bursting it now.
Flooding.
Puddle, blight.
Stun.
AoE fearing.
Oh wow, that was a full bar.
So that was proper use of debuffs. Optimally there, if I had Shadow Fangs Fates just a little earlier, I would have been able to get Shadow Fangs on farts as well. Again, I can't believe I'm saying that. And then that would have been an even easier kill. Okay, last clip here, so we're going to go ahead and get started.
Lexius next. I'm getting Leighton on Lexius. Hold on.
So,
Getting Leighton
refreshing
on
my
Lexius.
Shadow Fangs.
Okay, Leighton's on Lexius. We're going to wait for it to go off.
still down.
1.
Will I have time to get on farts as well? I'm kiting
We're
around.
gonna
looking.
burst it in.
So sometimes when I'm trying to disguise like what we're going for, we'll kind of run towards a different target. So that kind of looks like a little bit meandering, but we'd already know who we're going for, and I'm waiting for Shadow Fangs to come off of cooldown. So I'm trying to just kind of move around, see if I can like bait them into thinking maybe I'll target the wrong person. Sometimes I'll even before I burst, I'll target the wrong person just to kind of throw them off a little bit.
5, 4,
Gonna be
3,
close.
2, 1.
Got it though, but I am there on time. The Rend's hitting. The VT is just now coming in as the Rend is there.
Bursting it now.
Now, optimally, actually, I think our BA is a little early. So I'm on time because I'm hitting Rend and Puddle on 0, but the VT has already come in. So optimally, you'd want your BA to be just a quarter, half a second late so that he can benefit from his big hitters on the Puddle and the Rend. But my timing here is good.
Bursting it now.
Bang,
Loading.
bang, bang.
There's a stun.
And there's the Blight. Perfect.
Getting the follow-up mez.
Position.
Follow-up mez is there.
Okay.
Stay on it. Stay on it. Positional Spilo.
Dread yelling at me as I have positional.
All right, got him. Next target gonna be farts.
Yeah, and that's essentially it. So that's a pretty clean burst right there. I was able to get both Shadow Fangs up. I was able to get Rend up ahead of time. I was able to be there on 0 with both the Rend and the Puddle on time. Maintain positional, had good DPS rotation, and that's going to be either a kill 90% of the time, either a kill or force a big defensive cooldown 90% of the time. So very important there. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. If you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments. I know this was a long video, but there's just a lot to go over with Warg and group play. I'm going to have timestamps in the comments or in the description so you guys can skip around to what's necessary. If you have any other questions or want to get your gameplay reviewed, just let me know, and I'll be happy to help you out. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and let's teach people how to actually play Warg and group. Have a good one, guys.